I had meant for it to be a simple weekend, a couple of days of solitude, a battered truck, and a rifle propped against the wall of my small cabin high on Marrow Ridge. Hunters out here follow unspoken courtesies. If someone knocks and asks shelter in a storm, you let your neighbors know. You don't keep secrets in the mountains. That rule felt distant the moment the sky folded itself into iron and snow began to thicken, like sifted ash, and what started as a bright, cold morning became a whiteout appetite by afternoon. The hares were nowhere. The woods offered only the hard, indifferent face of the weather. By dusk I was lost, and the compass on my phone blinked a tiny, unreliable circle before going dark. My hands were numb even inside my gloves. I had to find a roof. Through the glare and the chorus of the wind, I found a silhouette of logs and a crooked chimney tucked in a bowl of pines. No smoke, no light. It hunched there like a promise. I should have kept walking, but the snow pressed its thumb against my ribs, and the mountain made the decision for me. I walked up to the door and rapped with the heel of my fist. The sound scabbed over with the snow's noise. For a long beat, no one answered. Footsteps came on the other side, deliberate, as if someone had been pacing and finally decided to approach. The door cracked open a little and a voice, close and low, said, "Come in. Leave your boots by the door." It wasn't welcoming. It was functional, practiced. I waited for a proper greeting, for that human noise that makes a room live, but nothing followed. The gap widened only when I pushed it open myself. Inside, 2 candles burned, thin and brave against darkness. The flame light begrudged space, leaving corners stitched into shadow. A couch sagged under a blanket near the center, and on the far side, where the candlelight didn't dare to claim the air, a human figure stood, a silhouette like a stain. The man, if it was a man, said nothing more. I set my bag down and propped my rifle against the log wall, because old habits don't melt in fog. I thanked him. He didn't answer. People in the mountains are strange in ways that are ordinary. They'll smoke silently for hours, ignore storms and strangers alike. I told myself that as I tried to unclench my shoulders. I lay on the couch, boots off, the wool a damp weight. Darkness pooled when I closed my eyes. It felt the same whether I blinked or not. I listened for the scrape of his boots moving away on the floorboards. Nothing. The house had the small, patient creaks of an old thing settling, but the one set of footsteps I expected never stepped. After a while, my eyes, stubbornly open beneath the lids, pried themselves back. The silhouette had not moved. It remained at the edge of the candlelight like a statue of absence. I told him, out loud, more to occupy the room than to expect an answer, "I'm going to try to sleep. Thanks for the shelter." My voice made a weird, thin echo. No answer. When I turned my head away, pretending to fall into sleep, the sense of being watched unspooled through my chest. I couldn't explain why the room felt wrong in a way that wasn't just loneliness. Compulsion is a soft, slow animal. It grew teeth. I turned my head and looked again. The shadow was closer. Not enough to be ridiculous, but close enough that the space between us felt thinner, like a gap closing. The candlelight caught on something pale, a sliver on a forehead, the sharp suggestion of skin too light for the room. My stomach flipped. I sat up, heart narrating its own panic. For a moment I thought I might be imagining the motion, the way snow and fatigue make small things loom. But the pail was there, awash against the dark that made the shadow a body, and the body a face I could not quite make out. It wasn't a friendly newness. It was a wrongness, a skin that didn't belong in a place shaped by soot and rain. I gathered my things so fast I nearly left my rifle. "Thanks," I said, stilted. I have to go." My teeth were bright against the cold inside my mouth. I didn't look at his face. I couldn't tell whether it was cowardice or a self-preservation instinct. I buckled my boots and opened the door. The storm welcomed me back with teeth. Snow tore at my collar and pushed me down the slope. I kept my head low and hurried, half running, half stumbling. Below, another cabin glowed with warm light, honeyed and impossible in that white world. I knocked until an old man answered with a woman behind him who looked like winter-made flesh. Lined face, hands that smelled of bread and something sweet. They ushered me inside without much fuss, gave me tea scalding enough to singe the snow from my beard, and a place by their hearth. I told them about the cabin up the hill, told them about the silhouette, about the pale forehead in a room lighted by 2 tired candles. The old couple exchanged a look like a map folding in on itself. The woman put a gentle hand on the other's sleeve and said slowly, "You're talking about Marrow House, aren't you?" The man confirmed with a nod so small it was almost a shiver. "That place hasn't had an owner in 2 years," the woman said. "He was murdered. The cabin's been empty ever since." My tea went cold in my hands. Outside, the wind laughed like something that had found a secret. My throat closed around a question I couldn't spit into the room. If that place had been empty, then who had answered my knock? Who had stood in the corner, patient as a shadow? The storm rattled the walls of the old couple's cabin, but inside, warmth pressed against me with the weight of quilts and the crackle of the fire. The man, Charles, he told me, sat in a rocking chair near the hearth, his wife Miriam close by with her knitting. The rhythm of her needles was a heartbeat to the room, steady and unafraid. They wanted to hear more of my story, though the words burned my tongue like frost. I told them how the voice had sounded low, calm, practiced, and how the figure had never once moved except when I wasn't looking. Charles's hands froze on the armrests of his chair, and Miriam's needles stilled mid-clink. They looked at each other again, the way people do when something unspoken is trying to claw its way into the room. Charles finally said, "Folks up here talk about Marrow House sometimes. You're not the first to see. Shapes in that cabin, most never go inside." He leaned forward, firelight carving hollows beneath his eyes. But no one I've known heard it speak. The words sat between us like stones dropped into water. I wanted to believe fatigue had painted shadows where there were none. My body had been dragging itself through snowdrifts for hours. The mind will play tricks when the cold scrapes at bone. Still, every time the wind found a crack in the logs and hissed through, I flinched, hearing the cadence of that earlier voice folded inside the draft. "Come in. Leave your boots by the door." The phrase repeated in my head, as though memorized without consent. When Miriam finally sent us all to bed, I tried to stretch out on the couch. The blanket smelled of cedar, the fabric heavy with age. But as the fire dimmed and the old cabin's natural creaks filled the silence, I couldn't hold still. Each pop of timber echoed like footsteps resuming a patient vigil. I turned over and stared at the window where snow feathered the glass. For a moment, reflected in that pane, I thought I saw a pale glimmer just beyond the candle's glow. Not mine, not Charles's. My pulse kicked. I blinked hard. The pain held only the blizzard's fury. I closed my eyes, but sleep was no shelter. My dreams returned me to the first cabin, its silence thick as fur, the figure waiting motionless in the corner, the candles bent low with their own strange gravity, shadows too eager to stretch and touch. Every time I tried to speak in the dream, my voice made no sound. The silence belonged to him. A sudden thump dragged me awake. My heart sprinted in my chest. For a second I thought Charles had stirred, but his snoring rolled steady across the room. Another thump, closer this time, like a heavy hand against a wall. Then, nothing. The quiet returned, sharp as a blade. I told myself it was a branch falling under the snow's weight, though branches don't knock twice. At last I drifted into uneasy half-sleep, my body begging for it. Just before the darkness pulled me under, I swore I felt the pressure of eyes on me again, colder than the storm outside, like something had followed me down the hill and was only waiting for me to look. I slept in fits, a thin, splintered kind of rest where every small house noise became a sentence. The knock or thump that had woken me felt like a punctuation mark between dreams. I kept seeing the corner of that other cabin when I closed my eyes, the way the candlelight refused to cross the threshold of shadow, how the dark held itself like a secret waiting to be told. At dawn, the storm had mellowed into a gray bruise. Snow lay like ash on the path. I stood on the porch of the old couple's house, feeling like I had been given something dangerous and wrapped in cloth. Knowledge that would burn if I dared to use it. Charles and Miriam fussed at me in the kitchen, pressing boiled eggs and bread into my hands as though food could solder a broken day. They escorted me up the path toward Marrow House with 2 lanterns cutting small halos into the snow. "We ought not to go," Miriam said under her breath. But she came anyway. People keep their rules, but sometimes curiosity is a rule that likes to be broken. The cabin sat where I remembered it, squat and patient between the trees, no smoke threading the sky. Up close, the logs seemed to have a skin to them, weathered and pulled tight, the grain like veins. The door looked the same, scarred by weather. Charles knocked once and the house answered in the voice I knew. The door cracked, and the same low instruction slid through. "Come in. Leave your boots by the door." Hearing it outside the frame of my first memory was like hearing echoes that had returned home. We stepped into the dim, and for a second the world narrowed to the candlelight and the shape at the far edge, a shape that resisted being called human. Only this time I could see more. The pallor that had hinted at a forehead was a face with the wrong angles, like someone had taken a familiar face and stretched it over an unfamiliar skull. Its skin clung to bone like paper. It smelled of old snow and something metallic that made my throat tighten. "Who are you?" Charles asked, though his voice was as small as the candle flames. The figure's head tilted, not quite in curiosity, not quite in the mechanical imitation of a nod. No words came. Instead there was a soft sound, almost a whisper, but the sound was wrong, composed of multiple low breaths that didn't sync with the body's motion. It felt like the house itself was inhaling. The candles guttered, and for a breath's length every corner seemed to creep a fraction closer, as if the room had decided to lean in. I tried to step forward, and the wood beneath my boot gave a thin complaint. My rifle was heavy in my hands, suddenly useless and therefore necessary. Miriam made a small, sharp noise and clutched my sleeve. "Don't," she hissed, and the sound was ancient with fear. "Don't meet it with anger. It does not like being seen like that." Seen? I thought wildly. I had already seen it. The idea that seeing changed something pressed cold fingers along my spine. The silhouette moved, not with feet, but with the slow, incremental advance of shadow itself. The space between us shrank like a hallway closing. The pale skin began to take some sort of shape. A mouth, unpracticed in human expression. Eyes that held the reflection of the candles but not the light. When it opened its mouth, the sound was at once a memory and a lie, a voice that echoed the first words I had heard, but threaded into them was a pattern that felt like mimicry, like an actor practicing kindness. "Come in, leave your boots by the door." The syllables landed with a soft, venomous grace. Then it did something I hadn't expected. It laughed. The laugh was a small, scraping thing that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Not a laugh of joy, but of recognition, like finding the right key after fumbling through a pocket. I felt my skin prickle. My thoughts stuttered. Why would a dead man's cabin speak? Why would a dead man's voice call me? Questions fell around the room like loose teeth. In the corner of my eye, something moved, quick and precise, something that looked like a shadow stepping into shadow. The temptation to look away was immense. The human part of me wanted to obey every animal instinct, run, flee, put as much distance as possible between myself and the wrongness. But I had already been given the knowledge. Some small, stubborn piece of me wanted to see the end of what I had begun to witness. "Who killed you?" I said before I could stop the question. My voice sounded too loud inside the wooden ribs of the house. For an instant the figure was still. Then it tilted its head again, and the raw-sounding laugh fissured into a whisper that was almost my own name, not spoken but suggested, as if memory had tried to reproduce me in part and failed. Around us, the house seemed to settle deeper into itself. A wind tapped at a far window, and the sound of it became like distant footsteps pacing the eaves. The figure took another step forward, and the candlelight found the hollows at its eyes. I recognized there an absence more than a gaze, a patient, hunger-shaped hollow. "What do you want?" Miriam asked, small as a mouse, hands clasped wrong in front of her. The thing moved closer until the tips of its fingers brushed the edge of the nearest candle's glow. In that small reach, I saw a detail that made the room lurch. A smear of dark, almost like old rust across one pale knuckle. It could have been anything. Stain, shadow, the trick of light. But my mind refused to allow ordinary explanations. The house inhaled. The figure whispered, and the voice sounded like snow covering a trail. "Shelter," it said, "and company." Charles, who had been silent until now, suddenly laughed, a strangled thing that might have been courage or madness. "We leave it," he said, voice breaking. "We don't feed ghosts." But by then the house had finished whatever quiet ceremony it required. Something in the corner, the way the shadows wrapped themselves, made a sound like breath slipping through teeth. I realized, with a clarity that felt sharp as broken ice, why the first silhouette had not spoken at length. It had been listening. Ghosts are patient predators. They are not loud because they do not need to be. They wait for company to feel complete. And when company comes willingly, when someone steps into the dark wanting shelter, the border between living and unlife thins. I stepped back. The wood at my feet complained like a throat clearing. There was a flash of motion at the far corner, fingers curling, then unclenching. The figure leaned in, not to attack, but to accept, as if I were a visitor leaning forward to catch a train. The air itself seemed to harden. "Get out," Miriam said, and her voice was iron. "Now." Her hands were white on Charles's arm. He grabbed the lantern and pushed me toward the door. We moved without looking at the figure again. Outside, the breath of the world felt fresher and crueler. Snow had muffled the sound of our retreat, and the trees leaned like witnesses. Behind us, the thin curtains at Marrow House shivered, as if someone had run a hand across them. A noise followed. A soft, sibilant thing like satisfied fabric settling. I walked until my calves burned, and my lungs felt as empty as the man who had once owned that place. At the bottom of the hill, the old couple's small light shone like a promise of ordinary things. Heat, bread, 2 pair of knitting needles clicking time back into the world. But the image that lodged in my mind as I looked back at the darkened roof was not their hearth. It was the silhouette in that corner, small and patient, leaning into its own shadow as if it had always been waiting for company. When I finally told the story again, months later, to someone who liked a ghost tale, I couldn't summon the exact tone of the voice. Memory softens edges. What lingered, stubborn and awful, was the impression that some things are kind when they want to be, and terrible when they are not seen. The mountains keep their rules. Give shelter in a storm, notify the neighbors. I kept that rule, and in doing so I saw what the mountain keeps in its dark rooms. The polite thing had almost killed me, because some courtesies, like houses, have a way of holding on.